So today I'm going to outline some early biological theories and then talk about family twin and adoption studies and some other biological risk factors for violence. And then probably next time we'll move on to some particular regions of the brain and particular neurotransmitters. And then lastly, we'll finish off with some wider implications for society and legal scholars. I'll tell you about a case. First of all, this is Jeffrey Landrigan. He was born to parents who were drug addicts and criminals and who neglected him. But he was removed from the home, and thankfully he was adopted at 9 months of age, so pretty early, and he was adopted into what seemed like a very good family. They lived in Oklahoma. The dad was a geologist. They already had a little girl. The little girl grew up to be an outstanding citizen, so there didn't seem to be any issues with the household. But very early on, Jeffrey was displaying evidence of a conduct disorder. By age 10, he was stealing cars and had a drinking problem. By his early teens, he had been arrested for an attempted robbery. And then in his late teens, he got into an argument with a friend who had just asked him to be the godfather to his child. And Jeffrey stabbed this friend to death, was arrested, managed to escape prison, and flew to Phoenix, Arizona, where he could have started anew. But there he got into a fight with a stranger at a Burger King and again found himself arrested for murder. This time he was facing the death penalty. And when he was on death row, an inmate told him, "You look just like this other inmate called Darrell Hill." Indeed, Jeffrey Landrigan was the spitting image of Darrell Hill, and DNA testing showed that Darrell Hill was his biological father. Both had ended up on death row for murder, and both had a lifelong criminal career. But it doesn't end there. Darrell Hill's father, so Jeffrey's biological grandfather, also was a lifelong criminal who had been killed in a shootout when robbing a drugstore. So here we have 3 generations of criminals, no impact from the environment that we can see that would have led Jeffrey down an antisocial or criminal pathway. And so, of course, this is one case, but it raises some interesting questions over how much our genetics may have to do with antisocial behavior. I will come back to these sorts of issues soon. First of all, let me cover some early biological explanations of crime, because there was some early theories that focused on a biological basis to criminality. One example is constitutional theory by the American psychologist Sheldon. Sheldon believed that crime is largely a product of people's body type, or somatotype, as he called it, because he believed that different body types inherently have different temperament traits linked to them. So the 3 body types that he identified were, first of all, endomorphs, a more obese body type that he characterized as being high in extroversion and high in agreeableness. So someone who is jolly and sociable, but polite and compassionate and cares about others. Ectomorphs, who are particularly thin, he characterized them as being introverted and neurotic, so particularly reserved and prone to withdrawing behavior. And then mesomorphs, which he characterized as a more muscular type, which was, again, high in extroversion, but low in agreeableness. Okay, so this person, yes, was stimulation seeking and sociable and lively, but they were also disagreeable, okay, prone to conflict and thinking about themselves. In his study, he observed 400 males in a prison rehabilitation environment, and indicated that there was more mesomorphs here than there was in the general population, arguing that it was because of their innate temperament that had led them down the path of criminality. Now, obviously, this is a correlational finding, even if Sheldon's observations are generalizable. It's only a correlation. It's not saying anything about causation. And so quickly, there was some critics of this perspective. First of all, the observations couldn't be replicated, but some of the main criticisms are summed up by Feldman. that even if there was a relationship between, for example, a more muscular body type and being more likely to be arrested for a crime, it doesn't mean at all that there's some sort of inherent temperament makeup that's responsible for that. First of all, bodybuilding may be instrumental in attracting police attention, might influence sentencing. Such individuals might more match the typical stereotype of a criminal, and so might be over-selected because of this in the criminal population. And also perhaps bodybuilding increases testosterone levels, and as we'll come back to, this has been linked to aggressive behavior and criminality as well. So an early example, but not a very good theory. Another one was Jacobs' theory, which is based upon XYY syndrome or Jacobs syndrome. So in 1961, this condition was found that some men have two Y chromosomes on the 23rd pair of chromosomes, so an XYY syndrome. And Jacobs proposed that this irregularity was linked to criminal behavior. Indeed, in his study, he found that it was 40 times more prevalent amongst forensic populations, particularly if they had an intellectual disability as well, in comparison to the general public. Arguing that this extra Y chromosome resulted in extra masculinity and extra aggression. Indeed, other studies as well have found that it's rarer in the general population in comparison to the forensic population. And also in more recent studies, when comparing those with this syndrome to those without, and then giving them measurements of delinquency or aggression, they found that those with the syndrome do often report higher in these characteristics than those without it. But it's not a finding that's been replicated again and again. Okay, there's some studies failing to find significant differences between forensic populations and the general population. There are often case studies brought forward, okay, when this position is argued. So for example, Arthur John Shawcross was a serial killer who did, yes, have an XYY profile, and he did kill at least 13 women between 72 and 1990. He also had a history of sexual assault and cannibalism. Okay, but other than this syndrome, he also had an IQ below average. He suffered severe head injuries as a child, and as we'll talk about, traumatic brain injury has also been linked to an increased risk of criminality. And he suffered both physical and sexual abuse as a child. So as is often the case in these sorts of cases put forward to argue for the influence of an XYY syndrome, there's all these other risk factors as well, okay? So is it due to XYY, or is it due to these risk factors, or is it due to a combination, okay? Probably the best known biological theory of criminality is from Lombroso, who was a prison doctor in northern Italy. And when doing autopsies, he observed that there were some physical differences between the inmates and the general population. In his 1876 book, Criminal Man, he argued that criminals are a lower classification of humans, okay, that there is an evolutionary hierarchy and that criminals are at the bottom of this, so they are an evolutionary throwback. His theory, therefore, was deterministic, okay? He believed these people were born to be bad, that there was nothing that could be done to help them, and that because of certain physical characteristics, they could even be identified before committing a crime. When Lombroso was alive, he was quite popular for this theory, but soon after his death, it fell into disfavor and criticism. Future studies couldn't replicate the findings exactly. So one example is by Goring, who compared a group of Navy officers to a group of offenders and found no significant differences in the physical markers that Lombroso had laid out. More recent research, though, and not just recent research, but collectively about 100 years of research, have told us that there are some minor physical abnormalities that are more prevalent amongst criminals than the general population. Obviously, some aspects of Lombroso's theory were wrong. These people are not born to be bad. But there does seem to be some characteristics found on average that are more prevalent. I'll come back to this, but obviously none of these are direct causes of criminal behavior, okay? So you can check your hand right now. Do you have a pinky that's straight, or do you have a pinky that's slightly curved? Don't check right now maybe, but maybe later have a look at your toes, and do you have a substantial gap between your big toe and your second toe? No. If you do, don't panic straight away. You're not necessarily a homicidal maniac, because one or two of these on their own actually don't have much predictive power. But what we find is that if there's 4 or 5 of these abnormalities, then it does statistically significantly increase the odds of criminal behavior. Now, why would that be? Okay, obviously, there's nothing about having a curved fifth finger that causes someone to commit a crime. But what researchers are concluding is that these abnormalities are reflective of disruption to fetal development. Okay, when there is disruption to fetal development, typically it's not one thing that's disrupted. Typically, it's a range of things. Okay, so in line with 4 or 5 of these being disrupted, there would also likely be parts of the brain, the limbic system or the prefrontal cortex, for example, that was also impacted in its development. So Adrian Raine published a best-selling book called The Anatomy of Violence, and he's the best well-known theorist in terms of biological and the biological risk factors for violence and the kind of neuropsychology of criminal behavior. His conclusion is that about 50% of the variance is explained by genetics and about 50% explained by the environment. So the nature-nurture debate therefore comes out at a tie. Both the biology and the environment influence criminal behavior. In some cases, the environment more, in some cases, biology more, but as a generalization, it's about 50-50. Now, obviously, Lombroso was wrong in some aspects, okay? People are not born bad, okay? There's no destiny set in stone here. But what we find is that there are certain brain abnormalities that make it more likely one might be impulsive, that might make it more likely they're aggressive under certain situations. And so they increase the risk and the odds of criminal behavior. And sometimes these can be somewhat identified by some of the physical markers if there's enough of them, as I laid out on the previous slide. So I'll talk about the role of genetics first and how this is studied, and then I'll talk about particular risk factors that might influence brain development, for example. So some definitions to be aware of. A genome refers to your full collection of genes, okay? So you have between 20 and 30,000 genes, of course, across 23 pairs of chromosomes. Heritability is the statistic we use to work out how much of the variance in something is due to genetics, okay? So there's various ways that we can work that out. So for example, identical twins who share about 100% of their genetic makeup, who are separated at birth and raised in completely different environments. If we look at the correlation between them, the similarity between them on a given personality trait or antisocial behavior, whatever it is we're looking at, that would give us a direct marker of heritability, okay? Because whatever the correlation is between them, that would indicate a genetic influence because they haven't shared the same environment, so it wouldn't indicate an environmental influence. So if the correlation for extroversion, for example, is 0.5 between identical twins reared apart at birth, that would tell us that about 50% of the variance is explained by genetics. And what we find in psychology, no matter what the personality trait is we're looking at, whether it's antisocial forms or extroversion or openness, about 50% of the variance is explained by genetics in these studies. You know, it differs somewhat from trait to trait. Extroversion, for example, is more like 60%, but roughly on average, it's about 50% of the variance explained in personality by genetics. Now, a genome refers to the influence on a characteristic from genetics, okay? So, for example, a genotype, sorry. The genome is your complete set of genes. The genotype is a characteristic influenced by your genes. So, for example, your eye color is purely determined by your genes, okay? It has no influence from the environment. So, you know, if you have blue eyes and so on, determined by your genes, in comparison to a phenotype, which yes, is influenced by your genes, but isn't necessarily reflective of it because it's also influenced by the environment. So height, weight, personality traits, for example, these are all phenotypes because they're influenced by genetics and the environment. Or an example I like is the color of flamingos' feathers, okay? Yes, obviously a genetic influence, but also they turn a brighter shade of pink based upon the amount of fish that they eat. So it's a phenotype because it's influenced by both the environment and genetics. So when we're talking about antisocial personality, the phenotype is the category in which it would fall. So the Jim twins are an example of identical twins who were reared apart at birth, okay? They were adopted into separate families, had no knowledge of each other. And then when they were about 39 years of age, they discovered one another. And they discovered some amazing similarities, okay? They both had a dog with the exact same name. They had both been married twice. Both of their wives had the exact same names. They both had a son. They both named the son the exact same. Overall, the similarities between them were striking. And of course, this got the attention of psychologists who gave them a whole range of personality questionnaires and other psychometric tools. And overwhelmingly, they were very, very similar, even on projective tests in which, you know, it was very open and ambiguous. So for example, if they were told, write down a story, any story, the stories they wrote were almost identical. They both had frequent headaches, they both smoked, and both had the same favorite brands of cigarettes. Now, they weren't identical in every way. They styled their hair differently. One was technically a better writer than the other. But overwhelmingly, the amount of similarities were really, really striking. Now, of course, just one case, okay? But again, it raises interesting questions over how much our genetics have to do with who we are. So when we're trying to determine this, we use genetic studies. There's three main types that we will use. General family studies that typically look at the relationship between parents and children. So for example, in the relation to criminal behavior, for example, do criminal parents have criminal children? Twin studies, two types of twin studies. The type I've told you about in which identical twins are reared apart at birth, okay? And then we see if there's a similarity between them. That's obviously a pretty rare type of study, okay? There's not that many identical twins. You know, about 2% of the population are twins and about 8% of that are identical. So the identical twins are already hard to get, and then to find ones who were reared apart at birth is even more hard. An easier type of twin study to do is comparing identical twins to non-identical twins, okay? Identical twins share about 100% of their genetic makeup from the same fertilized egg as a result of a mutation. Non-identical twins from two separate eggs, 50% of their genetic makeup just the same as any other siblings, okay? So if identical twins are more similar than non-identical twins, that would be an argument in favor, theoretically, of genetics. So there's hundreds of these types of studies, okay, comparing identical to non-identical. And then lastly, there is adoption studies, okay? So going back to the Jeffrey Landrigan example, but imagining thousands of such cases, okay? Children who were born to criminal parents, but then adopted by non-criminal parents. What was the likelihood that they would grow up to be criminal? So talking about them each separately, the benefit of family studies is we know how genetically similar people are based upon their family tree. So like I said, you share about 50% of your genetic makeup with your siblings, assuming they're not an identical twin. About 50% with both your father and mother. By your grandparents, it's about 25%. By great-grandparents, it's about 12.5%. You know, by the time of aunts and uncles, 25%. The great aunts and uncles, 12.5%, and so on and so on. And so obviously, if you're more alike those that you're more genetically similar to, that would be theoretically an argument in favor of the influence of genetics. But what's the most obvious criticism of these types of general family studies? Right, so those that you're more genetically similar to, you're more likely to share an environment with. So for example, if you were raised by criminal parents who were your biological parents? Was it the genetic influence, or was it the environmental influence because you were raised by them? These sorts of studies don't allow us to separate the two. But yes, they do indicate that criminal parents are more likely to have criminal children. In one study, boys with a criminal father were twice as likely to become a delinquent. And the same was also true in another study for females as well. But like I say, this doesn't allow us to separate the influence from genetics and learning theory / the environment. So a better type of study is twin studies, like I've described. The most common type is comparing identical twins to non-identical twins. One issue with this is the equal environments assumption, okay? We're assuming that the environment of identical twins is no more similar than the environment experienced by non-identical twins. Identical twins are more likely to be dressed the same than non-identical twins. You might argue they're more likely to be treated the same by family and teachers and so on than non-identical twins. And so that theoretically could be having an impact on the results. So the best type of twin study is the identical twins reared apart at birth, because then we clearly can tell the difference between the genetic influence and that which is not genetically influenced. Indeed, when we look at the concordance rates, so similarity rates, whether it's looking at convictions for violent crimes, but also convictions for non-violent crimes, or diagnoses of conduct disorders or antisocial personality disorder, what we typically find is that the identical twins are twice as likely to be similar than the non-identical twins, okay? So the fact that they're twice as likely, again, is arguing in favor for about 50% of the variance being explained by genetics. And what we find is that adoption studies are largely telling us the same story, okay? That those who are adopted by, who were adopted but who had biological criminal parents, they're at an increased risk of criminality, regardless of whether their adoptive parents are criminal or not. So in one study, criminal convictions were higher when the biological father had a conviction, about 21.4%, in comparison to when the adoptive father was a criminal, but the biological father was not, okay, about twice as likely. And, you know, the latter is pretty similar to norms anyway, so it's not actually increasing the risk very much. Yeah. I see what you're saying, right? So there's going to be better socioeconomic status and so on. Yeah. Yes, but if the father grows up to be a criminal, the adoptive father, then the argument would still be, if you were a learning theorist, for example, that there would be something in the environment that may have increased the odds of that child growing up to be a criminal, but actually that's not really what we're finding. But yeah, your criticisms are right, yeah. Unsurprisingly, the highest risk was when both the adoptive father and the biological father were criminal. In this case, 36% of the participants grew up to have a criminal conviction. And obviously lowest when neither, okay, so about 10.5% when neither was a criminal. So not a whole lot of difference between that and when the adoptive father was a criminal. So there are hundreds of studies on this, really all coming to the same conclusions, but this is one overview of the literature that I think just makes it somewhat digestible or easy to understand. Okay, so let's look at what happens if the adoptive parent is criminal, but the biological parent is not. Well, according to one review, at best, it makes the individual twice as likely to have a criminal conviction later on. But when the biological parent only is a criminal, then it's about ×4, okay, so twice as much as when the adoptive parent is a criminal. And when both the adoptive parent and the biological parent are criminals, then we might be raising the odds about 14 times. But overall, it's indicating a good argument for there being a genetic basis to criminality. But what it tells us is that 50% of the variance is explained by genetics, okay? Whether it's convictions or antisocial personality disorder, but that still leaves 50% unexplained, which is explained by the environment, okay? So that's why I said the nature-nurture debate comes at a tie, okay? Both are having an influence. But of course, we can break down the environment by shared environment and non-shared environments, okay? So what I mean by that is the shared environment is that which is occurring within the home that would be shared by siblings. So the parents, for example. The non-shared environment would be everything outside the home that's not shared by siblings, okay? So there are different peer groups, for example, there are different teachers, there are other unique life experiences. Now, earlier on, the assumption was that the shared environment would be more important. But one review by Zuckerman in 91, in fact, concluded that the shared environment is much less important than genetics, and the non-shared environment is still less important than genetics, but more important than the shared environment. A more recent review by Adrian Raine of over 200 adoption and twin studies came to the same conclusion, okay, that genes accounted for about 50%, the other 50% explained by the environment, but more so by the non-shared environment. On average, across these studies, about 35%, whereas the shared environment, about 15%. Okay. Any questions on anything there? So these 200 plus studies are looking at children from about as young as 4 all the way up to adulthood, okay? So it's a collection of conduct disorder diagnoses in childhood, other markers of antisocial behavior, antisocial personality disorder diagnoses in adulthood, white-collar crime, violent crime rates, non-violent crime rates. Again and again, this is about what we see. It doesn't seem to make a difference when we make the measurement, okay, whether it's in childhood or adulthood. Any other questions? Okay, a few definitions to be aware of, okay. Genotype environment interaction is referring to how sometimes people respond differently to the same environment based upon their differences in genetic predispositions, okay? So a good example is some differences between extroverts and introverts. By this point, we have pretty good evidence that there's some genetic component to extroversion, okay? And extroverts and introverts often respond very differently to the same environments, okay? When studying, introverts are typically more bothered by background noise than extroverts. Introverts are typically overstimulated by caffeine when doing a task, whereas extroverts are sometimes performing better on tasks when having caffeine. So a whole range of other examples too, but quite often introverts and extroverts respond differently to the same environment, likely because, at least partly because of some difference in genetic predisposition. Genotype environment correlation is the fact that your genetic predisposition and your environmental exposure are often correlated with each other, okay? Quite often when one experiences a genetic predisposition, for example, they're often experiencing an environmental exposure that's congruent with it, especially in terms of parenting, right? If you want to, have a gentle, nurturing parenting style with your child and you want them to grow up to also be very caring and compassionate, then you've passed that on to them in terms of your parenting style, but you've also probably passed on a genetic predisposition to act that way, okay? And so both are going to be correlated with one another. So a passive correlation, a passive genotype environment correlation, is when there is both the environmental exposure and the genetic predisposition, but the infant or child hasn't done anything to select the exposure or to evoke the exposure. So the example I just gave you would be a passive correlation. Another one could be a parent who reads to their child from an early age and tries to get their child interested in intellectual activities, okay? that's an environmental exposure. Probably the child will grow up in a home in which there's lots of books and lots of reading material, but also the parent is probably passing on some genetic predisposition to be intellectually curious about the world and so on. So the two will go hand in hand. A reactive correlation is when the child evokes some sort of exposure, okay, based upon their genetic predisposition. So maybe by nature, you have an infant who's very temperamental, who's difficult to soothe, who's very emotional, who's crying all the time. Even very early on, infants will differ in terms of temperament, how easily soothed they are, and so on. And then maybe because of how emotional this child is, maybe it stresses the parent out, and the parent becomes more stressed when dealing with the child and less patient than they might otherwise have been had the child not been so emotional. And so in that example, the child is evoking this particular environmental experience. Active is when you deliberately seek out an environment that's congruent with your genetic makeup, okay? So by nature, you're someone who is stimulation seeking, and so you decide to go on a roller coaster or skydiving or something that's congruent with that, okay? Or you have a genetic predisposition to liking sweet foods and enjoying sugary foods, and so you eat lots of desserts, okay? You're selecting that particular environment. Yeah. Sure. So if you're trying to work out which correlation it is, the first question you might ask is the child selecting it? Okay, are they deliberately selecting it? If the answer to that is yes, then it's active. The next question might be, are they evoking it? Okay, they're not deliberately seeking it out, but in the example I gave you, for example, a difficult temperament is bringing out a more stressed nature in the parents, okay? The child obviously isn't looking out to have a more stressful parents, okay? But they're evoking that because of their behavior. If the answer to that is also no, so the child hasn't selected it and they haven't evoked it, then it's simply passive, okay? They haven't done anything to seek it out. It's just been passively passed on to them, okay? Neither through evocation or through selection. The distinctions make sense? Any questions? What I want to do now is tell you about some particular studies, okay, mostly by Adrian Raine and his lab, which have really looked at the biological factors to do with antisocial behavior. So in this study here, we have 4 groups of participants. Okay, there is a control group who have neither birth complications or experienced maternal rejection. We have a group who experienced maternal rejection determined by interviews with a social worker. So the children in this group were not wanted by their parents, first of all, and then were removed from the home, removed from their parents during a critical period, i.e. the first 2 years of life. Okay, I'll talk more about the critical period when we talk about attachment theory, but maybe you've came across it before, especially if you've done a developmental class. But these children were not wanted by their parents and were removed from the home during the first 2 years, probably because of neglect or abuse, removed by a social worker. The first group experienced some severe birth complications when they were born that would have been traumatic and likely resulted in some sort of brain impairments that we'll go on to discuss. The fourth group experienced both, okay, both the birth complications and the maternal rejection. Now, what you can see is on the y-axis, arrest rates for violent crimes decades later, okay, about 21 years down the line. The control group, roughly about 3% were convicted for a violent crime. Not a significant difference between them and the other 2 groups, okay? But the final group, the group that had both the birth complications and the maternal rejection, were 9% likely to have a violent criminal conviction, okay? 9% of them were convicted for a violent crime. So it's a threefold increase, okay? This was statistically significantly more than the other 3 groups. The other 3 groups were not significantly different, okay? So what this tells us is that one of these on their own did not necessarily increase the odds of criminal behavior, but the combination of the two did. Yeah. An actual complication during the delivery. But this was an all-white sample in Copenhagen, Denmark, and in psychology, we aim to replicate our findings. Now, this study has been replicated several times, but I'll give you one example, an all African-American sample in Philadelphia using the exact same research design and finding basically the exact same results, okay, that the combination group with both birth complications and maternal rejection have about a threefold increased risk of violent criminal convictions later down the line. And again, no significant difference between the other three groups. Another biological risk factor that's, again, been identified in various studies, but I'll just give you one example, is poor nutrition. Now, this is an interesting study. It was done by researchers in New York State, but in their study, they looked at participants from the Netherlands, a study of 100,000 participants, so it's a large study. During World War II, areas of the Netherlands experienced blockades, meaning that food couldn't be delivered to those areas of the Netherlands. And so, of course, there's pregnant mothers there, just like there is everywhere, who are malnourished, and so they're not passing on the nutrients needed to the fetus. And then, of course, in other parts of the Netherlands that didn't experience this blockade, they're having access to their normal diet, to their normal food. They're not malnourished. And so decades later, in the mid-90s, the researchers followed up on the offspring of these pregnant mothers, okay, comparing the offspring to the pregnant mothers from the areas which had been experiencing a blockade, and so the mothers were now malnourished during pregnancy, comparing them to mothers who had given birth to offspring in other areas of the Netherlands, okay, so who were not malnourished. There was a 2.5 times higher likelihood of having an antisocial personality disorder in adulthood in the malnourished group in comparison to the non-malnourished group. So malnourishment is one risk factor for violence, okay? That might impact fetal development, that might impact brain development. Another one is smoking during pregnancy. Again, study after study, but I'll give you just one example from Copenhagen, Denmark, of over 4,000 males, and it was investigated how much their mothers had smoked during the third trimester in pregnancy. So we have a group of mothers who didn't smoke at all during the third trimester, a group who smoked on average 1 to 2 cigarettes a day, 3 to 10 cigarettes a day, all the way to an average of over 20 cigarettes a day while pregnant. We have violent crime rates at age 34. And what we see is a dose response increase, okay? Now, this is a correlational finding. We don't determine causation from correlation, but a dose response finding gives us just about as close to causality as we can get in this type of study. What I mean by that is every single step of the way, as there's an increase in cigarette smoking, there's an increase in violent crime, okay? And various other studies have found this. This is not like a typical correlation when, for example, all the findings might be at the high end. Everyone who is high in one trait might be high in the other variable, okay? This is a dose response that's completely stable across the correlation, okay? Now, the final group is significantly higher in terms of their conviction rates than the lowest group, okay? If we look at statistically significant differences, the other comparisons are not statistically significant, okay? Just comparing the first group here and the final group. Now, we could argue that maybe this also is disrupting fetal development, that it's causing impairments to brain development. But what might your counter argument be to that? What's the obvious criticism? Yeah. Right. So once the baby's born, most likely, what's this mother going to be like in comparison to this mother, for example? Yes. You could argue that if the mother is smoking more than 20 cigarettes a day on average, knowing that it's bad for the fetus, then there's a good probability that she might be a more antisocial parent once the child is born. And so she might be passing on an antisocial personality trait this way. There's an environmental confound. But we have seen in other studies, when looking at direct impacts on the brain from nicotine exposure, that there are effects, okay? First of all, there is reduced volume of the prefrontal cortex as a consequence of nicotine exposure during fetal development. It also reduces the ability for zinc to be transported to the fetus during fetal development. And zinc is high in particular areas of the limbic system, for example, the amygdala. But for now, we're going to focus on the impact it's having on the prefrontal cortex, because that's been most clearly illustrated. I'm going to come back to why the prefrontal cortex might be relevant, okay? So we've talked about malnourishment, we've talked about smoking. Another one is drinking excessively during pregnancy. Okay, if you do so, it can result in fetal alcohol syndrome. It's a rare condition, okay? But in one study, the researchers managed to recruit nearly 500 participants with this condition, okay? So given how rare this condition is, it's a good sample size. The rate of delinquency in this group was 61%, okay, across the 473. 58% of them had contact with police in adulthood. 54% of the males had been arrested and convicted for a crime after age 12. Okay, so more than half. And 33% of the females had been arrested and convicted for a crime after age 12. You can see here the direct impact that fetal alcohol syndrome has on the brain. Okay, these are two children who died shortly after birth. The one on the left here does not have fetal alcohol syndrome. The brain looks as we would expect it at that age. The one on the right is a child of the exact same age who died and who did have fetal alcohol syndrome. And you can see how shrunken the brain is in comparison and how impaired it will be. Now, as I discuss these issues with you, I'd like you to, consider broader issues, for society and for justice, for example. Look at this little boy here. Does he have fetal alcohol syndrome? Yes, he does. We can tell by certain facial markers. Is this young boy going to commit a crime when he's older? Obviously, we don't know that. Nothing is set in stone, okay? There's no destiny. But certainly, the odds are against him, okay? According to this research, actually, there's a greater probability that he will commit a crime than not. But more broadly, there's about a 4 to 5 times higher risk in comparison to someone who doesn't have the syndrome. Now, did this young boy choose to have fetal alcohol syndrome? Did he choose for his mother to smoke and to drink excessively rather during pregnancy? Obviously not. But if he does grow up to commit a crime, will he be held responsible for that? And the answer to that is yes. He'll be treated, the same as someone who doesn't have the syndrome in terms of guilt or innocence. My question, and I'm not going to answer it for you, but is that justice? Is that your idea of justice? And you can have your own idea on that. But the question then would be, well, if he's not responsible, who is responsible? Someone has to be held responsible for when a crime is committed. So if not the boy, then who? Well, some people might say the mother. And indeed, that's happening in some states. So one example, Jamila Falls gave birth to a baby girl in July 5th, 2014. But the baby girl, on the day she was born, tested positive for heroin and marijuana. In the state of Tennessee, this is a crime. It's an assault on the fetus, okay? And so she was sentenced to 6 months in prison. But presumably she didn't set out to have a baby who was test positive for drugs on the day it's born, okay? Clearly this is a drug addict who's also struggling. And is 6 months in prison really going to make any difference to this? The answer to that is probably not. Okay. And so another question maybe, does this person need handcuffs, or is there more society can do to tackle these sorts of issues? Obviously, the ultimate goal I think everyone would agree on would be identifying risk factors as early as possible, okay? So that the young boy, for example, didn't grow up or didn't develop fetal alcohol syndrome in the first place. So we've covered smoking, drinking, malnourishment. Another one is lead exposure, okay? Again, pretty robust finding that goes back several decades. We found a correlation between lead exposure and criminal rates across countries, within countries, across cities, okay? Now, it's a correlational finding. So again, it's not demonstrating causality, and there could be other confounding variables, okay? Those cities that have greater lead exposure, for example, typically have higher poverty rates. And so there could be other factors at play helping explain the relationship. But nevertheless, there is some strong advocates for this being a leading cause of increased risk of criminal behavior. In the late 70s and the early 80s, there was a great effort in this country to reduce lead exposure, to removing it from pipes, water pipes, and to remove it from paint and so on. And what happened when about 15 to 20 years later, when the children who would have been developing at that time were then later adults in the mid-90s, there was the biggest plummets in crime rates that the country has ever seen. Okay, and many criminologists argue that that was largely due to what was done to reduce lead exposure. But we've also seen direct impacts on the brain from lead exposure, particularly to the temporal regions of the prefrontal cortex. So I've mentioned the prefrontal cortex several times now, okay? All of these biological risk factors increase the risk of criminality and do so during fetal development, and they disrupt fetal development and certain brain structure development, particularly the prefrontal cortex. And so I'm going to explain now why that might be the case. So obviously going back to what I said near the beginning about those physical characteristics, those on their own are indirect markers, okay, of disruption to fetal development, disruption to brain development. They might indicate one of these neurotoxins or environmental toxins I've just talked about might have occurred. Now, the frontal lobe is the part of the brain at the front responsible for cognitive skills, problem solving, language, self-awareness, self-control. If there is damage to the brain, then unsurprisingly, the part of the brain or the functions of that part of the brain will also be impaired, right? If you damage the part of the brain that's responsible for sight, then unsurprisingly, there's going to be consequences on your sight. And the same is true when there is damage to this area of the brain. It has an impact on your impulse control and your problem-solving abilities and your general cognitive skills and executive functions. The prefrontal cortex is the very front part of the frontal lobe. If people slap their foreheads, that's typically what they touch. Being highlighted as a mediator for violent behavior, being compared to the brakes on a car or the angel on your shoulder, okay? When you feel provoked, when you feel a great urge to do something, it's the part of your brain that says, no, don't do that, and stops your impulse. Now, there are a number of studies that have found prefrontal cortex dysfunction is more prevalent amongst convicted murderers than the general population. A clear correlation between prefrontal cortex dysfunction and criminality. The earliest of these studies was done by Adrian Raine in California in 1997. He got a group of 41 convicted murderers pleading not guilty by reason of insanity, and then matched them to controls based upon age, sex, and evidence of schizophrenia. They underwent a continuous performance task, some sort of cognitive abilities assessment, when their brain activity was being measured via a PET scan, okay, which measures blood flow. So the blood is flowing to the parts of the brain that are being used. And so in a cognitive task, we would expect the frontal lobe to be highly activational, okay, because you're engaging in problem-solving abilities and using executive functions. In the control group, that's exactly what we see. The more red areas are activating, indicating blood flow and higher activation. Okay, so the frontal lobe here is at the top. Okay, during the cognitive task, good activation of this area of the brain. Okay, when we look at the murderers, the same is not happening. Okay, this part of the brain isn't lighting up during the cognitive task. It's indicating dysfunction. But not all murderers are the same, okay? There was one murderer in this sample who had killed 66 people over a 12-year period, okay? And this individual's brain does show good activation of the frontal lobe and specifically the prefrontal cortex in comparison to the control group, maybe even more so than the control group. Now, that's not too surprising, right? To get away with killing 66 people over a 12-year period and to evade capture for that long, you have to have a certain level of cognitive skills that most inmates, most prisoners might not have, okay? In fact, this individual was only caught because he was pulled over for a minor traffic violation, and his latest victim was on the passenger seat of his car, so it wasn't a difficult case to solve. And so this led Adrian Raine to the idea that if we split murderers into reactive murderers, okay, so those who had killed in some sort of provocation versus those who had been cold-blooded, premeditated, and planned their attack, we would only find the prefrontal cortex dysfunction in the reactive killers. And when he split the killers this way, this is what he found, okay? So this is based upon the idea that there's two types of aggression in animals and in people, okay? There's a more defensive, reactive type of aggression that's hot-blooded, okay, when people are provoked or they perceive being provoked, okay? And then there is a more predatory, instrumental, calculating, cold-blooded type of aggression, okay? So again, during this task, poor prefrontal cortex activation in the reactive killers, but we don't see the same dysfunction in the predatory killers, okay? Now, a caveat here, this is a group illustration, right? It's allowing us to make generalizations or predictions at a group level that if we're comparing reactive killers to predatory killers, we might expect more prefrontal cortex dysfunction in the reactive killers, but it doesn't allow us to make predictions on an individual by individual basis, okay? There is going to be exceptions to this. There might be, in this sample, a reactive murderer who does have good prefrontal cortex activation, for example, okay? I want to kind of give some context to what I'm discussing, okay? Because the correlation between prefrontal cortex dysfunction and criminal behavior is the most replicated finding when it comes to biological studies of criminality. And well, we have to be careful with these sorts of conclusions. These are strong effects, and I want to give you some comparisons to give you an idea of that, okay? Everyone here, I assume, accepts that smoking increases the risk of lung cancer, okay? I'm talking about a relationship that's at least 5 times stronger than the relationship between smoking and cancer, okay? There's people all over the world who take aspirin because it has been shown to decrease the likelihood of a heart attack. I'm talking about a relationship that's at least 100 times, up to 150 times stronger than that relationship, okay? So this is a well-replicated, strong finding. And what we found is when we look at samples of murderers, it's overwhelming how many of them show frontal lobe impairments and prefrontal cortex dysfunction. And that's an issue I'll come back to when we talk about homicidal offenders later. Now, I should say this might be a consequence of what I've discussed. So, for example, fetal disruption. But it could also, of course, be early trauma, right, from persistent abuse. It could be, for example, persistent head trauma that's resulted in some sort of brain impairment, okay? So it's not, negating any kind of social influence. But these are correlational findings. Like I say, on their own, they don't indicate causality. But there are some case studies in which we can get close, if not be confident in causation. Cases in which we know what the individual was like before there was disruption to this area of the brain, and then we see a change directly after there is impairment to this area of the brain. I'm going to come back to the case of Michael, or the case of Mr. Oft, and the case of Dante Page. But you probably all know the case of Phineas Gage, right? You've probably heard of this. He was a railway worker in the 1800s who had an iron rod blasted through his head. He somehow managed to survive, but it did cause severe damage to the prefrontal cortex and frontal lobe. And those who knew him say that there was a profound change in his personality before and after. Afterwards, he became much more impulsive, much more aggressive, much more confrontational, and much more argumentative. And the other two examples I will come back to. Any questions on anything I've covered so far? Yeah. Sure, okay. So the predatory killers are those that premeditated and planned in advance their crime, okay? So it's calculating and cold-blooded. It wasn't in the heat of the moment. Whereas the reactive murderers were unplanned. It was spontaneous. It was in the heat of the moment, typically during some sort of argument, okay? So it's a hot-blooded type of crime. Any other questions?